Welcome, students. Today is our podcast on what's called in the topics list, the Great War, otherwise known as World War I. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about another PowerPoint slide that I have in there. We don't have a separate podcast for it because it's fairly short, so I thought we'd just wrap it up into this one. And that's called the, quote, alliance system. And really, what I want to highlight on that is if you take a look at the slides, you'll see a lot of different names of alliances. And I want to just break that down and kind of distill that down into its simplest form. Starting in the 1900s with the so-called balance of power strategy, what had begun to happen in the aftermath of the creation of the state of Germany, the European powers, France, England, Russia, Germany, Austria as being some of the main ones, they began to kind of scramble to create so-called secret arrangements between nations in the event of a war. And so we call that the alliance system. Now, Otto von Bismarck, if you remember him, he was the prime minister that created the state of Germany. He very quickly realized that because of its size, because of its economy, and because of its military power, that Germany would be instantaneously feared and would force kind of a ripple effect of alliances. And so his goal was to try and kind of prevent that. And so you might ask, why did I pick the year 1890 as for the start of these alliances systems? And the causes for that are pretty simple. Basically, Bismarck worked to try to minimize Germany's power as it would be expressed or as it would be seen readily on the outside. And he did that up until he got fired as prime minister in 1890. And so because of that, even though we see some of these alliances kind of forming, the real process of setting up the stage for World War I in this alliance system didn't come together until the 1890s and early 1900s, about a 20-year period. Now, what Germany tried to do was traditionally it had a fear of being caught in a two-front war. And that fear was between France and Russia, who were traditional allies working together against Germany. Now, that relationship between France and Russia had already been kind of strained by the so-called Crimean War, if you remember that on a previous slide. So things were not great there. And so what Otto von Bismarck tried to do in a meeting called the Congress of Berlin is he tried to widen that gap between France and Russia by trying to help Russia get a warm water port, access to the Mediterranean. And so even though he knew it wouldn't work, he pledged Germany's support of Russia's demand for access to the Mediterranean. Now, in response to that, England and France, who had fought the Crimean War against that same idea, they once again joined together to form a diplomatic bloc to that process. And in doing that, Otto von Bismarck basically was able to wedge further the gap between France and Russia, all the while to open up a door of communication between Germany and Russia as allies. And if you look at the alliance system, that's exactly what Otto von Bismarck tried to create in the late 1880s. We have the so-called Dual Emperors League, which was an alliance between Germany and Austria, two German-speaking countries, to work together. It's called a mutual defense pact. That means if anybody attacks one of the members of the pact, the other will not help the enemy and will, if they feel the need, help out their ally. And so what happened is we have kind of these two groups coming together. Germany and Austria, pretty easy grouping, and because of their fear of Russia, France and England were starting to come together. But they didn't really like each other, so always keep that in mind. The French and the English really don't like each other. Now, as time went on, Bismarck was able to bring Russia into that dual emperors alliance and create what's called the Triple Emperors League. Now, when he created that, the Three Emperors League was basically Austria, Germany, and Russia, who were traditionally not allies. And so that was a pretty big diplomatic victory. Now, when that occurred, basically England, which was already loosely allied to France, sought an additional ally in the form of the Japanese. And this is where the Japanese really start to become a factor. We didn't really talk about the Japanese during the imperialism lecture, but Japan had been imperialized by America in the 1860s. And they had been imperialized by America so much that just like in China, the Japanese government had imploded. But unlike China, what took its place was a dedicated Japanese government that was dedicated to becoming Western. They began to industrialize very quickly. They began to modernize very quickly. And basically less than 45 years, Japan went from being a country that was dominated by European powers and America to being a Japanese country that defeated Russia in the so-called Russo-Japanese War. And that's on a slide if you take a look at the imperialistic lecture. So Japan went very quickly, in less than basically 40 years. They went from being a non-industrialized Asian country to being a combination, an amalgamation of traditional Japanese society and Western technology, which if you take a look at Japanese culture today, you'll see that that's still pretty much what they are. Traditional Japanese society merged with Western technological advancement. And so Japan was becoming more important, becoming a, quote, world power, and the British looked to shore up their control of India with the aid of the Japanese Navy, because the Japanese had a predominantly strong navy. Everything was going pretty good for Germany until Otto von Bismarck was fired, and in 1890, the Kaiser, the King of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, basically Kaiser William II, basically decided to ramp up Germany's overseas empires. It put them in direct conflict with England, and it also began to become aggressively expansive to its neighbors, which put them in opposition to both France and Russia. And so basically what happened, long story short, as those relationships broke down, the relationship between France and England grew stronger. The relationship between France and Russia grew stronger. And finally, by 1910, England and Russia put aside their differences and in terms of their competition and the issue of the Japanese. Remember, the Japanese allied themselves with the British, but they had defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. So eventually all those problems passed away, and you had a camp of three allies: France, England, and Russia. And on the other side, you had Austria and Germany, and at a last-minute effort, they combined, or they had an alliance with a third country called the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim-based empire that controlled the Middle East. And the main reason why the Ottomans joined with the Germans was because they had been basically being beaten by the Russians. So this was kind of a, if the Russians are not your friends, then you must be my friend type situation. Now, the reason why the Austrians and the Germans wanted the Ottomans to ally with them was because then they could get cheaper oil prices for their military. So basically what happened as we approached 1910, we had two opposing camps, as the slide says: England, France, and Russia versus Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, the repercussions of that are pretty simple. If anything happened, there was going to be, quote, a world war. A war that would be between European powers that would be fought basically throughout the world. And that's exactly what happened. Now, if we look at the causes for World War I, nationalism. Every country wanted to be the best. Every country was hoping to prove their superiority. Secondly, the diplomatic tension had been building over these race for empires overseas. And because of that, things were breaking down diplomatically. Thirdly, And this is just a simple kind of situation. Since there hadn't been a major war in so long of time, people were kind of unaware of what a war would mean with modern technology. And you'll see that on the slide. There was an ignorance of the impact of modern technology. For example, the machine gun, chemical warfare in the form of mustard gas grenades, etc. So there was a lack of war and an anticipation of honor. There was an ignorance of military technology had advanced, and basically everybody was kind of gearing up for this. All it would take would be a spark. Now the Germans, sensing that war was coming, they created a plan called the von Schlieffen Plan, which basically forced them to be the first move, to make the first move in a war. If a war broke out, the Germans had to strike first at France to basically knock France out of the war so they could then focus their efforts on Russia and avoid a two-front war. It's called the von Schlieffen Plan. They were just basically waiting for a situation. Now, if you pay attention to the quiz, or if you take a look at anybody who's talking about World War I, they'll tell you that the immediate cause of World War I was the assassination of the Crown Prince of Austria. And basically, here's what happened. Crown Prince of Austria was on tour for his honeymoon, and a Serbian, remember how I said Serbia would be important, a Serbian terrorist who had crossed over the border into the Austrian Empire, assassinated the Austrian prince, and then got back into Serbia. Now, when that happened, of course, the Austrian government demanded Serbia turn over the organization that had claimed credit for the assassination. When the Serbians refused, the Austrians threatened the Serbians, which doesn't seem like a big deal until we know that the Serbians were the allies of the Russians. And so when the Serbians felt threatened, they went to Russia and they got Russia to threaten Austria. And then when Austria was threatened by Russia, Austria went and talked to Germany and wanted Germany to back Austria versus Russia. And when that happened, it very clearly was a smoking powder keg waiting to explode. And so what happened is the Germans basically told the Austrians to go ahead and write the check and the Germans would cash it, meaning, do what you got to do, we'll go to war. In anticipation of that, the Germans enacted the von Schlieffen Plan, which called for them to invade France through the independent country of Belgium. They did that. Once they invaded France, the war was on, and in retaliation of the Belgians being invaded, England declared war on Germany, France declared war on Germany, Russia declared war on Germany, and then Austria and the Ottoman Empire, in support of their ally Germany, declared war on the other three countries. It's important to note that the Serbians, who were at the center of this controversy, predominantly were able to stay out of the war, except through Russian support. So, long story short, nationalism, competition, all those things came together to spark World War I. Now, I'm not going to give you a piece-by-piece detailed description of World War I. Just so you'll know, obviously, we have very little activity took place on the so-called Western Front, which the Western Front was the border between Germany and France. Most of the fighting that took place there was extremely bloody. It was trench warfare based. And you can see the list of the tear of technology. This war would be unlike any other. Massive casualties due to technology and an ignorance of the technology. And not only massive casualties, but horrific fighting conditions. Trench foot, which is based on trench warfare. Trench foot is a condition in which the water saturates your skin and then your skin starts to peel off in layers due to the excess water. Since you're in a trench and you can't leave it, all of your compadres who happen to get shot and fall into the water basically rot next to you for the next few days. And as you get trench foot, your skin is then, the meat of your legs, your feet are exposed to that infected water, which causes infection. Conversely, gas grenades, mustard gas grenades, were extremely horrific in terms of their effects, because what they did is they didn't explode and kill you that way normally, but you would breathe in the mustard gas, which would slowly burn your lungs, forcing you to suffocate to death over the course of days or even weeks. So I could go on and on, but let's just say literally one of the most horrific wars in human history, and because of the ignorance of technology and the way that the war was fought, it was a tremendously bloodied war with lots of casualties and lots of injured people. Over 6 million civilians were injured, non-military combatants were injured in World War I. Total death toll was about 14 million. In terms of soldiers, about 6 million civilians. We're talking more than 20 million people, which was by far at that point the largest war that had been fought. The front in the west moved a few miles back and forth. The front on the east, however, was extremely successful for the Germans. The Germans crushed the Russian military because the Russian military were predominantly under-resourced and under-trained. In fact, we have the story of the so-called, what the Russian soldiers were told was that you didn't get a gun because they didn't have enough. So stand next to a fellow soldier who had a gun, and if they died, you got to use it. Which means that only half your army was basically outfitted with guns in World War I. Things were so bad for Russia that they, in one single battle, lost 1 million men. Just think about that for a minute. 1 million Russian casualties in a battle over the course of 2 weeks. Now, long story short, Russia was failing in the war, and eventually they had to pull out. Their government imploded as a result of the stress of the war. The Germans were doing really good at holding off the French and the British until what occurred is what's called unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. The British were gaining supplies and aid from the Americans. Even though we had pledged to be neutral, America was sending supplies. In response to this in 1915, the Germans sank a British liner which had some Americans on it, less than, I think it was only 4 or 5. They sunk a British ship called the Lusitania. And that, of course, as you might expect, angered Americans. But we did not enter the war then. We stayed out from 1915 to 1917. However, in 1917, when the Russians pulled out of the war, the Americans entered the war in response to the Japanese threatening to sink more ships in the Atlantic, ships which would put American lives at risk. In 1917, America entered the war, and basically Germany realized very quickly that they could not win the war with a fresh America involved. And so in 1918, in November of 1918, the Germans basically negotiated and signed a ceasefire, an armistice, ending World War I. And at that point, the war was over, but nobody was the winner, nobody was the loser, and the war had been fought for no territorial gains. Nothing had happened in terms of people getting more land, and about 20 million people dead over the course of 4 years, from 1914 until 1918. So, as you might expect, long story short, the war was over and people were pissed off because they had given all this life and resources for this war and there was no result. In fact, if you take a look at the dates of the Treaty of Versailles, you'll notice the actual peace process took 3 years to negotiate, from 1919 to 1922. And when it was all said and done, what resulted in the Treaty of Versailles made no one happy. And I'll give you a few cases. You can see them all outlined on the slide. Germany was forced to give up its government as a result of the ceasefire. At the end of the war, even though not a single battle had been fought on German soil, the Germans were forced to accept the blame for the war.
things.
Okay, so at the end of the war is over, the armistice is signed, but, like I said, the Treaty of Versailles took 3 years to negotiate and had solved no problems. In the outcourse of the Treaty of Versailles, basically, the Americans, with the British, tried to recreate the world, to make the world, as President Woodrow Wilson said, make the world safe for democracy. What they did was they tried to redraw the map. They broke up the Ottoman Empire, creating such countries as Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Middle Eastern countries we're familiar with today, Iraq, Iran, etc. They also then gave all German territories to the Japanese in Asia, which only fueled the Japanese fury for expansion, which we'll talk about being important. And last but not least, they kicked the German people down so low that they were willing to accept any kind of leadership. And that leadership would take the form of the 1920s and 30s of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So World War I, keep in mind, World War I, one of the biggest keys to World War I is that World War I set the stage for World War II, because the main reasons why the war started, nationalism, were only increased. That pressure and stress was only increased in the aftermath of World War I. Now, when I said no country was happy, I'll do a quick rundown. America, even though we had won the war, so to speak, we had basically compromised on everything to get Woodrow Wilson's dream in place, which was called the League of Nations. Now, unfortunately, when the war was over, the treaty came back to America, and the American government, the Congress, voted not to sign the treaty and voted not to join the League of Nations, which was our idea, which our president's idea. England was disappointed because they got nothing really from the war, no territories, and they had to basically be the couriers of the payments from Germany to France. So they had to carry the money, but not get the money. And as we talked about, the English and the French did not like each other. So what helped French was not really a great thing in terms of the British mindset. The French lost a lot of life for their young men. They lost a whole generation of men. And they also basically were now forced to try and put their country back together, because most of the fighting in the Western Front had taken place in their country. The Germans lost their economy, they lost their government, they lost their navy, they lost their army, and they were basically so demoralized that they were looking for anyone to help. The Russians, who were not even involved in the peace process because of the so-called Communist Revolution of Russia, they were completely shut out, and as a result, they weren't happy. And last but not least, the Japanese were happy, but felt that they should have gotten more through their support of the British. So when it's all said and done, the war was over, no one was happy, and because of that, we have the 1920s, which we call the period of basically disillusionment in Europe. In America, we call it the Roaring 20s, a 10-year period where we threw a decade-long party to try and forget World War I. We'll take up the story of the Russian Revolution next in our podcast. See you then. Thank you.